everyone. Welcome to the first episode of Season 5 of ARBinBRIEF, a practical video guide on handpicked arbitration issues. My name is Aseel Zimmo. I'm an independent international arbitrator and a dispute resolution practitioner based in Bahrain, and I am part of ARBinBRIEF team. I'm very excited to moderate today's episode. Today, we are exploring the realities of being a sole arbitrator, balancing complexities, impartiality, and clarity with my two dear friends, Dr. Asma Al Rasheed and Ms. Michelle Nelson. Ms. Michelle Nelson is the CEO of Rockfrose Legal based in UAE. Michelle is a very experienced arbitration practitioner who acts as counsel and sits as an arbitrator, both sole and in panels, primarily on construction-related disputes in the Middle East. Before setting up on her own advocacy practice, Michelle was the head of the Middle East construction dispute practices for two international law firms and has been based in the region for over 20 years. Dr. Asma Al Rasheed is a partner at Al Rasheed and Partners law firm, where she leads the firm's Dubai practice. She is an arbitrator and a lawyer licensed to appear before the UAE courts and the DIFC courts. Dr. Asma specializes in commercial and maritime arbitration and serves as a member of the executive committee for Sharjah International Arbitration Center, Tahkim. Thank you both for joining me today. I would like to start with you, Asma, asking you questions about how you manage complex evidence and decision-making when you sit alone as an arbitrator. From a factual or technical complex disputes, what's the biggest practical, psychological challenge you face as a sole decision-maker?
Thank you for having me in the beginning, Aseel. And honestly, the first challenge I faced sitting as a sole arbitrator wasn't procedural, it was simply psychological. I had always assumed that my first arbitration experience would be a part of a tribunal sitting alongside other arbitrators, learning from the group dynamic. But in reality, my first appointment was as a sole arbitrator, and I remember wondering if I was ready for this. Accepting the responsibility was the real challenge, and with your first appointment, you want to get everything right, and you naturally wish you could test your reasonings on or the decisions against others, which was not an option. Beyond that, there is like one constant challenge, which is managing the parties' expectations, because they always expect efficiency, timely responses, and when you sit alone, there's no division of roles.
Yes, absolutely. I hear you. I was very lucky to be sitting on my first arbitration as a panel, but my first one as sole arbitrator was pretty terrifying. Michelle, with that benefit of co-arbitrators, as Asma just described, and testing your ideas or interpretation, how do you maintain the confidence in your assessment, especially in complex and conflicting evidence?
Thank you, Aseel. It's a pleasure to be here. And in my mind, it's all about structure and making sure that you create a process and opportunities within that process to sort of test your own reasoning. And so when I'm planning sort of how to go about my deliberations, both from a sort of timing perspective, making sure it's in the diary and you've got those opportunities to do it, I would ensure that I build in sort of opportunities to go back and test what you've done and what you've decided to see if the logic sort of holds good. So you have a bit of sort of, space within sort of your initial decision-making process and be able to come back to it, etc. And then consider yourself to the extent that you almost test the opposite side of the argument as well, and to see if it still holds good. And I think within that structure concept, it's also all about making sure that you have a process, you outline your reasoning and how you've got there, so that you've got that sort of mechanism in place.
Thank you very much. Asma, I'd like to come to you to ask you, how do you deal with the need for administrative support when you are dealing with large, complex disputes, and how do you maintain neutrality in doing so? I think Asma's frozen. Right. I'll ask you, Michelle, while Asma tries to figure out her technology problem. How do you manage the dynamics with counsel and parties in such cases, especially when sorry, go on.
No, go.
So I would say, especially when test procedural limits or overload the record with document or expert opinion, especially in complex construction disputes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a common issue with construction cases. And sometimes you find that counsel equate volume with persuasion, which is, simply not the case. And certainly from my perspective in terms of arbitrator, you need to set the tone and the structure of what you need and expect from an early point of that process. And as part of that, you need to be firm about the proportionality aspect and clear that from your perspective, fairness includes efficiency. And also, I think it's important to make sure that you don't get carried along in the process as a passenger. And this can sometimes happen if you let the parties dictate the process. They set up a timetable, it becomes very convoluted, etc. And if you don't take charge and sort of control what it is you need, because it's your opportunity, the party's there to help you understand the issues. So if you set that procedural discipline early, and if you don't understand something, pause. Like, for example, disclosure is a really obvious one that happens time and time again, where if an arbitrator's not got to grips with what the case is all about at an early stage, you end up with some, crazy kind of convoluted process of disclosure where you don't know whether the documents that are being argued about are really necessary, etc. So again, be firm but fair, but be very clear that it's your procedure and that the parties are there to help you.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm glad we have you back with us, Asma. Asma, coming back to you, at what point do you decide it's appropriate to appoint administrative support as a tribunal secretary, for example, and how do you maintain neutrality in doing so?
Yeah. So I consider a tribunal secretary only when the administrative workload reaches to a level that risks slowing down the case. For example, when a party is self-represented and generates large number of correspondence, and when there are numerous parties or multiple procedural objections or applications. In all cases, I make sure that the secretary role is purely administrative, and make sure to circulate that and inform the parties about it before making the appointment.
Great, thank you so much. Moving on to the next part of our discussion today, navigating perceptions, in particular about impartiality, because that's very, very important in all arbitration. But to you, Michelle, as a sole arbitrator, you felt like there is greater scrutiny to your neutrality, as there is no panel to balance the perspective. And if you agree, how do you manage the perceptions of impartiality through the process?
Yeah, thank you, Aseel. I mean, it is a challenge when you're acting as sole arbitrator, and I think you need to ensure that you demonstrate impartiality through your conduct. So everything that you are doing and everything that you are saying could be taken out of context or in a different light. So obviously when you're issuing correspondence, it's easy to pause, take a moment, and check that it's all properly neutral, but in a hearing setting, it's even more important to not sort of make kind of throwaway comments that sort of might sound like you're agreeing with one of the parties or the other. And I think the other thing that I think is really important, I've had this myself, is never show or express frustration if you're in a scenario where a party might be potentially being a bit obstructive in the process, etc., and this sort of thing. And I think it's important to sort of always be measured about what you're what you're saying and how it's coming across. I had an instance where one party didn't show up to a hearing, and I was put in the position of having to effectively question that party's witnesses. And it's very difficult as somebody who's used to cross-examination, because I was wanting to sort of kind of test their evidence, but also I couldn't be seen to be challenging it in the context of whether it was true or right or could be sort of disputed. So that of itself was a very difficult exercise. But I think, as I say, have that in mind and keep very measured and very sort of neutral at all times.
Thank you, Michelle. Asma, what are your thoughts on this?
I totally agree with Michelle, and I really see that the example she put forward is really makes too much sense. But like what I would add is, I think an arbitrator should maintain his balance, even if he was challenged by one of the parties, because some parties just come in and try to question the impartiality, and this is one thing. And I think it always goes back to how consistent is the arbitrator. And how he handles the procedural matters, and how predictable he is to parties. If he were able, like an arbitrator was able to put that together, I don't think that there would be any impartiality perceptions by the parties.
Excellent. I absolutely agree. And maintaining impartiality and the perception of impartiality to the parties is very important, whether you sit as sole or in a panel, no doubt. Moving to the third part of our discussion today, which is the awards. We know how important that is. The whole process is for us to finally be able to produce a right and fair award for the parties. I want to ask both of you, please, what are your practical and strategic advice to ensure structured reasoning, enforceable awards when you're drafting a loan without anybody able to proofread after you or deliberate with? So can I start with you, Asma, please?
Yeah, sure. I've learned that drafting a loan becomes much more easier when the case has been structured from the start. So I use a word template I've developed over time, and from the beginning of the case, I start filling the factual and procedural sections, like the parties' details, representation, jurisdiction. I keep also a procedural timeline and an organized record. And by the time I start drafting, most of the foundation is already in place. Throughout the proceedings, I also maintain a running list of issues disputed by the parties. When I draft, I rely on summaries and notes and make sure that each conclusion links back to the evidence. And before finalizing, I step away and reread the draft with fresh eyes. And if the award feels clear and fair, it's ready. It's ready for publishing.
Thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, similarly to Asma, I think, structure and sort of process is really important. And to make sure, that makes sure that you have included all the issues and all the matters, and it becomes a bit of a checklist along the way. But in relation to the sort of what I call the guts of the award, which is obviously the reasoning around the parties' positions and your decision. Again, as a system, I would always make sure that if you're summarizing each party's position, when you start drafting it, you have to, it becomes very obvious whether you understand the points they're making as well. And so I think that whole process is, as Asma says, sometimes you get to the point where the actual decision part that you draft is almost quite short. Obviously you need reasoning in there as well, but the hard work is also, making sure that through your award, and an outsider can read it very clearly, that you have articulated the parties' positions. And that's not always easy, depending on how clearly they've articulated their positions themselves. So clear structure, process, and going back to the point we made at the beginning about sort of going backwards and forwards and just making sure that everything you've got in there makes sense, as well as being sort of capable of testing.
Thank you very much, ladies. Coming to the last few minutes of our time together, at least for this part, if you could share some tips to new arbitrators accepting their first sole appointment, what would that be? Asma?
Yeah, my first tip would be setting the tone early by establishing a clear and firm timeline in the first procedural order, having a well-organized record and structured notes to make the award drafting easier, and understand the facts and familiarize yourself with technical aspects of the disputes.
Thank you. Michelle?
Slightly different point. I would say avoid imposter syndrome as a new arbitrator. You know, you are capable of doing this and have confidence in your ability to do it, particularly if you for years you've practiced as counsel. You know how the arbitration process works, you know what's expected. So be confident, avoid that imposter syndrome. And then the second element of that is don't be rushed. Don't feel like you have to answer every bit of correspondence that comes from the parties within minutes of what of it being received. Take your time, pause and be measured, be calm, and then by so doing, you'll be maintaining your independence, your clarity, and your structure and discipline along the way.
Do you ladies believe it gets easier the more experience as a sole arbitrator? Asma, does it get easier?
I don't think so. It's the same, but you get more confident. Depends on the parties.
Yes, absolutely. Michelle, what are your thoughts?
I think it does get easier, although I caveat that by depending on the parties, etc. Right? You could have, even all of us after years could end up with a difficult case with difficult sort of, procedural aspects. But I think, in terms of what's expected of you and the process, like Asma says, you have your templates, you know the routine, but it still depends.
And on a personal note, do you guys prefer to sit as sole or in a panel? Asma?
To be honest, I never sat as a panel, but I always get sole arbitrators, but I would want to try the panel, and then I would make my decision.
Absolutely. Michelle?
I think I prefer a panel, to be absolutely honest. It can be a lonely road as sole arbitrator in certain circumstances. So, you do feel a bit friendless.
Yes, I absolutely agree. Thank you both very much for sharing your practical insights and your great tips and how to deal with the lonely road, as Michelle said, of being a sole arbitrator. It is a reminder that independence and discipline and structure actually a great mindset for the work as an arbitrator as other work. In closing, I'd like to thank our partner organization, ICDR and the ERA Pledge, for their valuable support in making season 5 possible. We're also truly grateful to the many organizations that support the marketing of our series around the world, Careers in Arbitration, Rising Arbitration Initiatives, and many, many other supporting organizations. For those of you who are watching us over YouTube, our video ends here. Thank you for joining us. See you at future ARBinBRIEF videos on handpicked arbitration issues. Please follow us on LinkedIn and like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. We would love to hear your comments and feedback, and you can register for our next episode on www.ARBinBRIEF.com. We look forward to seeing you there.